Let's start this third and final session here today. Let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this session. We'll start with a meditation, a resting in awareness practice, the shamatha practice we're doing today, but we'll introduce a little bit of questioning into this practice. So we'll be crossing a little bit the bridge into Vipassana, and I'll explain that before we do the meditation. Then we'll follow that with a short review of some of the earlier points. And then we'll continue on in the text. And the next part of the text is talking about how to sustain this shamatha practice. And then following that, in the text, it talks about the results of the practice, achieving the result of shamatha. And then we'll do another meditation called open awareness, which is how we can bring both the resting in awareness and observing thoughts practice into daily life. Question answer, and then a short preview of the second half of the retreat next weekend, what we'll be covering in that part of the retreat. Well, let's start with this meditation. And for this meditation, again, we'll be using a quote from Padmasambhava. And the first sentence is the resting in awareness practice, where he says, while steadily gazing into the space in front of you, without meditating on anything, steadily concentrate your consciousness without wavering. So that is simply the resting in awareness practice. But then he says, occasionally seek out, what is that consciousness that is concentrating? Steadily concentrate again, and then check it out again. Do that in an alternating fashion, meaning alternate between questioning and resting, questioning, resting. And he says, even if there are problems of laxity and lethargy, that will dispel them. Because by questioning and then investigating, that will help to make our mind alert and thereby overcome laxity and lethargy. And then he says, alternate between observing who is concentrating inwardly and who is releasing. If it is the mind, ask, what is that very agent that releases the mind and concentrates the mind? And steadily observe yourself, then release again. By so doing, fine stillness will arise, and you may even identify pristine awareness. And so what he's doing here in this shamatha practice of resting in awareness is introducing some questioning. Who is concentrating? Who is releasing? And so forth. And that is for the purpose of overcoming laxity and dullness, so we can sharpen our focus. But also that question means we're now moving a little bit into Vipassana. So you may even gain some insight into the nature of the mind. That's what he means by identify pristine awareness. You may gain some insight. So that's what we're going to do in this practice now. We're going to do this resting in awareness practice, which is a shamatha practice, as we've been doing. But then partway through, we'll introduce a little bit of questioning and then that will move us a little bit into Vipassana, but also it will be helpful to dispel any lethargy or laxity because we have to pay close attention to the mind. So let's do that practice and see how we go with that questioning. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Allowing the mind to remain relaxed, still, and clear. Allowing the eyes to be at least partially opened, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, and simply releasing all appearances, allowing the mind to come to rest. Resting in awareness itself, simply knowing that you're aware. And to help overcome any agitation, tension, or distraction, release awareness into space, releasing all appearances and relaxing completely. Who is releasing awareness into space? Look closely. Look closely for the agent who's doing this. And then just rest, resting in awareness. And then to help overcome any dullness or drowsiness, then sharpen your focus, concentrate, knowing that you're aware. Who is sharpening the focus? Who is concentrating awareness? Look closely. And then just rest, resting in awareness. Who is resting in awareness? Who is the agent that is resting? Look closely. And again, just rest. Resting in the open, spacious stillness of awareness. Relaxed and alert. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Let's begin with a short review before we continue on in the shamatha part of this text. Early in the text, at the beginning of the actual shamatha practice, the text said, "Now attentively focus mindfulness on the mind's nature of awareness and clarity, and observe it single-pointedly and nakedly." So we're observing the mind directly as the object of shamatha. And then it says, when observing this way, whatever thoughts arise, simply recognize each one. Such a technique relies upon introspection. So this is the first of the two practices, shamatha practices, that we did yesterday, and that is simply observing thoughts. Would observe whatever mental events arise in the mind. The text goes on to say, alternatively, just like a swordsman's battle with the archer taught in the Vinaya scriptures, having generated strong mindfulness and introspection, as soon as any thought arises, cut it off completely, not allowing it to continue. Meaning to not pay any attention to any thoughts, to simply rest in the experience of awareness itself. And so that's the practice we've been doing today. And we saw there that we are trying to balance our attention. And the way to do that is, if we're too tight, then excitement will arise. And so we need to relax a little bit. If its focus is too loose, then it can be that we fall into dullness or laxity. Then we need to sharpen our focus a bit. So it's this sort of balancing act between being too tight and too loose in our focus. And then whenever we find a factor of stillness where our mind goes quiet, we have to be very careful about laxity, because it's very easy when our mind is quiet and still to just simply sink into laxity or dullness. And we saw here from Master Chandra Goman that this balancing act is not easy, and it only comes through experience, that through constantly developing our ability to fine-tune, we'll be able to eliminate more and more subtle levels of excitation and laxity and move towards flawless concentration, as we've seen in those 9 stages that we've looked at in the last session. And so then if we go on in the text, the next section is all about how to sustain the practice. And so there's a couple of methods that are mentioned here. First, it says, whatever thoughts arise, when you observe their nature, they vanish and a pure vacuity dawns. So you may have noticed that already. When you try to look at a thought, it disappears, it vanishes. Very good, because a thought can only persist if we feed it by identifying with it. And so if we are really observing thoughts well, you'll probably notice that as soon as you notice something, it goes. And when it vanishes, what's left is that pure vacuity, the space of the mind. And then the text goes on to say, similarly, if you also investigate when the mind is still, there is an unobscured, clear vacuity and vivid clarity. And the text says, then, seeing that there is no difference between the two is well known to the great meditators as the fusion of stillness and movement. The fusion of stillness and movement. And so by doing this practice, what we come to see is whether we are observing thoughts or whether we're observing just the empty space of the mind, we see that they're actually both the nature of clarity and awareness. That thoughts are not something outside of being clarity and awareness, and the mind is clarity and awareness. Like the analogy often given here is that, like ocean, the mind is like the ocean, thoughts are like the waves, they're both the nature of water. And so this is what's meant by here, the fusion of stillness and movement. Then text goes on to say, or alternatively, use the following method to sustain the stillness of mind. To sustain the stillness of mind means not to get caught up in the movements of the mind, to maintain that stillness of the mind. And so here the text says, no matter what kinds of thoughts arise, without stopping them, so we're not trying to block them, it says simply recognize when they move and where they move, meaning to pay close attention to see when they first arise and where do they go. So if we can catch that thought very early to see when it first arises and when it goes, where does it go? Where does it end up ceasing back into that space of the mind? So if we can do that, it says, by so doing, observe and settle in the nature of those thoughts. We'll see, again, they're just mere clarity and awareness. They're really simply displays of awareness. And it says, by settling in this way, movement will eventually cease and there will be stillness. Because if we are observing those thoughts in this way and recognizing them as simply movements, we're not feeding them. Every time we identify with the thought and emotion and follow it, or we try to suppress it, we're feeding it. So the habit of all of these thoughts and emotions coming up will get stronger and stronger and stronger. So all we need to do is step back and watch them and recognize and see them. They're just as movements of awareness, rising, passing, rising, passing. We're not feeding them. And then eventually the mind will become completely still. And there's an analogy given here, is that it says it is similar to the analogy of releasing a bird that has been held for a long time on a ship in the midst of a great ocean. It says, sustain this state in accordance with that said in a doha. It is similar to how a raven released from its ship circles in all directions and then settles back there again. So again, we don't need to fight with thoughts. We don't need to block them. We don't need to try and stuff them back in our mind. They'll simply disappear of their own nature. I like the analogy here that in ancient times, if a ship was out in a great ocean and was searching for land, they would tend to have these ravens, these birds on the boat, and then they would release a bird when they thought they were close to land. The bird would go up and up and up and up into the sky. And then if it saw any land, it would go. And then they would know that land was in this direction. But if there was no land around, the bird couldn't go anywhere and it just came back down and back onto the boat. So similarly, we don't need to do anything with thoughts. We don't need to fight with them or try and stuff them back in the mind. They will arise and they'll simply dissipate back into the mind. And then we have a quote here, a very nice quote that I like a lot from Yangompa, a great Mahamudra master, who says, do not view discursive thoughts as false and do not intentionally cultivate non-conception. So in this practice of observing thoughts are not problems. Thoughts are part of the object. So they're not false. We just observe them. We're not trying to make the mind still. If you've ever tried to make the mind still, you know it doesn't work. It just creates more thoughts. So we don't need to see thoughts as problems and we have to somehow get rid of them and block them and make the mind still. Rather, settle the mind in its natural state and keep a distant watch, and the mind will arrive at shamatha. All we need to do is step back and watch. Watch the thoughts. They can't go anywhere. They can't do anything. They'll appear and dissipate, appear, dissipate. And then we're not feeding them. And then over time, they'll get less and less and less and less. And eventually, the mind will become completely still and we will arrive at shamatha. And then the text goes on about sustaining the practice. It says, furthermore, if the present day trainees sustain this state by way of the 6 methods for settling the mind, they will become kings of this instruction. So what we find in the old Mahamudra text are these analogies of how to settle the mind. And by understanding these analogies, they can help us to better understand how to settle the mind, to sustain the practice. And then we really will become very proficient in this practice. We'll become kings of this instruction. So that the text says, what are the 6 methods? And then he's quoting a text which says, settle like the sun free from clouds. Settle like an eagle soaring in the sky. settle like an ocean-going ship, settle like an infant looking in a temple, settle like the trail of a bird in the sky, and settle like spread out matted wool. And so by using these analogies, understanding these analogies, we'll be able to settle the mind and sustain the practice and move towards shamatha. And it says here, through these methods of settling the mind, you will possess the meaning of yoga. This word yoga literally means to yoke or union. In Tibetan, it's nel jaw. And nel means natural state and jaw means union. So nel jaw or yoga, union, it means that we will unify with the natural state. We will come to connect with reality. Here, we will connect with the mind itself, then the conventional nature of the mind. And then in Vipassana, we will join or connect with the ultimate nature of the mind. So then the text goes on to describe each of these 6 analogies. So let's have a look at the description. What does it mean when we say settle like this, settle like that? So the first one is, it says, just as the sun free from clouds remains extremely clear and bright, likewise, by focusing on the clear light nature of the mind, it is not obscured by conceptions grasping to signs, laxity and excitement, and so forth. So simply by focusing on the mind itself, the clear light nature of the mind, then we're not obscured by all of these conceptions and laxity and excitement, just like a sun free from clouds, remaining bright and clear. The second one is, just as an eagle soars through the sky naturally, without much need to flap its wings, likewise, without the mind being excessively tight or excessively loose, sustain this state with a sharp clarity and in a relaxed manner without losing mindfulness and introspection. So just like an eagle soars naturally without really having this sort of flapping its wings a lot, so we also in this practice of shamatha, we are soaring like an eagle without making too much agitation, being too tight, too loose, just with sharp clarity in a relaxed manner, without losing mindfulness, introspection, just moving through the shamatha practice like an eagle soaring through the sky. And then the third one is, even though a great ocean is buffeted by winds, the waves are not able to disturb a ship even a little. Likewise, when settling the mind on an object, settle without being disturbed at all by coarse discursive thoughts. So just like a great ocean ship, even though there's lots of waves that hit the ship, it's not moved. So similarly, we are to be like that when we're settling the mind on the object, to settle the mind without being disturbed by all the thoughts that are appearing in our mind. The fourth one is, just as when an infant looks inside a temple, they do not investigate the fine details of the pictures, but rather they look without distraction at the overall scene. Likewise, when settling the mind on the object, settle it single-pointedly on the object without investigating whether the objects of the 5 senses that appear are attractive or unattractive, and without generating attachment and aversion. And so just like an infant simply looks very simply at the temple without sort of investigation, similarly here, we are to observe with bare attention the object directly without investigating all the things that appear, and because they will cause a lot of mental afflictions to arise. The fifth one, just as there is no trail left by a bird in the sky, likewise settle the mind evenly so that whenever pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feelings arise, you don't allow yourself to fall under the influence of any of the 3, attachment, aversion, and confusion. So just as a bird flies through the sky, it doesn't leave anything behind. It doesn't leave a trail behind. So likewise, not for us to leave a trail behind, in that when pleasant, unpleasant, neutral things arise, to not allow ourselves to get caught up in attachment to the pleasant, the aversion to unpleasant, and confusion with respect to the neutral feelings. And then the sixth one is, just as when matted wool is spread out, it becomes soft and pliable. Likewise, when settling the mind evenly, it becomes free from the coarse contact of the manifest three poisons, laxity and excitement. So when matted wool, we put water, it becomes soft and pliable. So likewise, to rest our mind so that it becomes soft and pliable, so that it doesn't get caught up or get caught up in the three poisons, it's the mental afflictions or laxity and excitement. So these are the six analogies that we used in a lot of the old Mahamudra texts to help us to understand how to sustain this state in this shamatha practice, how to sustain the practice. And then the text goes on to say then, through sustaining this state in that way, what kinds of marks of achievement will be seen? So when we sustain this practice in this way, and we're moving towards shamatha, what kinds of signs will we see that we're moving in the right direction? And then it says here, the nature of meditative equipoise is lucid and extremely clear, not obscured by anything at all. And since it is not established in any way as a physical entity, it is a pure vacuity like space. Moreover, whichever of the good or bad objects of the five senses that appear, they dawn vividly, just like reflections in a clear mirror. And the experience that dawns is free of identification, such as it is this or it is not this. And so what we see is that as we sustain this practice and we go deeper and deeper into this practice towards shamatha, there are really three qualities of mind that become more and more manifest. Here the first quality is clarity, that the mind will become here very lucid and extremely clear. Then also our mind will go into this stillness. And through this stillness, then we really have this sort of non-conceptual experience, this experience of non-conceptuality. And here it says, so we don't have a strong sense of me, an object, and so forth. There's just this experience of stillness, this non-conceptual experience. The mind become very still and non-conceptual. And so we won't have these thoughts like, it is this, it is not this, and so forth. But also the mind will start to become very joyful and blissful. A lot of bliss will arise in the mind. Now, these three qualities of clarity, stillness or non-conceptuality, and bliss are very attractive qualities. And so therefore, the meditation texts warn the meditators about these three qualities, because it's very easy to get caught up in craving and attachment for these qualities as they arise, as the mind becomes clear, still and non-conceptual and joyful and blissful. And when they arise, we go, wow, that's really so nice. I want that. I want that. And we end up having craving and attachment for these experiences. And then, of course, that craving and attachment, due to the craving and attachment, those experiences disappear immediately. And then we try to simply recreate those experiences with craving and attachment, wanting them. And then that's not, and then, of course, they won't arise because of the craving and attachment. And then we get more and more frustrated. And then our practice goes completely astray. So therefore, rather than getting caught up in craving and attachment for these experiences, then rather, as the text suggests here, use them as a sign of achievement, a mark of achievement, that we are actually going very well in this practice and going deeper and deeper into the practice. And then use these very experiences of clarity, stillness, non-conceptuality, bliss, to go further into the shamatha practice. but also particularly this experience of non-conceptuality, of stillness. There's a warning about misinterpreting it, because here we say that we don't say, oh, it's the mind is this, the mind is that, because the mind, we don't have this conceptuality, this coarse conceptuality anymore. But therefore, to not misinterpret this stillness experience, this non-conceptual experience, as an experience of an insight into emptiness. Because also the experience of emptiness seems to be very similar to this experience here. But there's a big difference. The non-conceptuality in an experience of emptiness is a realization that there's no subject-object duality. Whereas here, this non-conceptuality experience is simply that the coarse conceptuality has subsided, because now we're moving into stillness. So we actually haven't really realized anything at all. The mind has simply become still. And so there's no coarse conceptuality anymore. So not to confuse that with some profound insight into emptiness. And then the text goes on and it says, no matter how stable such concentration may be, if it is not imbued with the bliss of physical and mental pliancy, it is merely a single-pointed mind of the desire realm. Whereas concentration that is so imbued is said to be the mind of shamatha. And so we saw that in the last session at stage 9, we had single-pointed concentration. Stage 9, attentional balance, it's all effortless. We have single-pointed concentration, but we haven't achieved shamatha. So no matter how stable it is, we haven't achieved shamatha. We have to achieve this physical and mental pliancy to achieve shamatha. And so here we see in that shamatha chart, this part of the diagram is the top in the middle. This is symbolizing this physical and mental pliancy. And that pliancy is flexibility or serviceability of body and mind. It's said that when we achieve shamatha, our body feels light like cotton. And that's symbolized here by the meditator flying through the sky. This is physical pliancy. And then mental pliancy is that in achieving shamatha, we can turn our mind to whatever we want without any resistance whatsoever. And so that's symbolized by the meditator riding on the elephant of the mind. We can turn our mind to whatever we want without any resistance whatsoever. That's mental pliancy. To look at this process in more detail of how we move from stage 9 to shamatha, that's very nicely, clearly described in Attention Revolution from Alan Wallace. So let's have a look at how we move from stage 9, the 9th stage, to shamatha in terms of this physical and mental pliancy. So this is on page 155, and he says the following. Following the realization of the 9th stage of attentional balance, you are primed to achieve shamatha. The 9 preceding stages entail many incremental changes, but the actual accomplishment of shamatha involves a radical transition in your body and mind. You will be like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. This shift is characterized by specific experiences that take place within a discrete, relatively brief period of time. According to accounts from the Indo-Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, the first sign of the achievement of shamatha is the experience of a sense of heaviness and numbness on the top of your head. This allegedly happens to anyone who experiences this transition, regardless of the specific method followed. It is said to feel as if a palm were being placed on the top of your head. It is not unpleasant or harmful, just unusual. Something remarkable must be taking place in the cortical region of your brain at this point, but so far no one has monitored the brain correlates of this shift using magnetic resonance imaging or an electroencephalograph. This physical sensation on the top of the head is symptomatic of a shift in your nervous system or network of vital energies that is correlated with gaining freedom from mental dysfunction, a general state of mental imbalance characterized by stiffness, rigidity, and unwieldiness. Consequently, you achieve a state of mental pliancy in which your mind is fit and supple like never before. From a contemplative perspective, when the mind is dysfunctional or prone to laxity and excitation, it is hard to generate enthusiasm for healing the afflictions of your mind or for devoting yourself to virtuous mental activity. Once you are free of such mental dysfunction, you can focus your mind without resistance on any meaningful object or task. And such a mind is now set to be fit or serviceable. This is the key to achieving optimal mental performance. Following this sense of pressure on the top of your head, you experience the movement of vital energies moving in your body. And when they have coursed everywhere throughout your body, you feel as if you are filled with the power of this dynamic energy. You are now freed of physical dysfunction, so your body feels buoyant and light like never before. Both your body and mind are now imbued with an exceptional degree of pliancy, which makes them remarkably fit for engaging in all kinds of mental training and other meaningful activities. When physical pliancy initially arises, the vital energies catalyze an extraordinary sense of physical bliss, which then triggers an equally exceptional experience of mental bliss. This rush of physical and mental rapture is transient, which is a good thing, for it so captivates the attention that you can do little else except enjoy it. Gradually it subsides and you are freed from the turbulence caused by this intense joy. Your attention settles down in perfect stability and clarity. You have now achieved shamatha. Sounds pretty good. Then the text goes on and says the following. He says, Panchen Lama says, it, meaning shamatha, is the source of many excellent qualities, such as extrasensory perception and paranormal abilities. And in particular, the Arya paths of all three vehicles are attained in dependence upon it. So when he talks about extrasensory perception here, this is including things like remote viewing, seeing things from a long distance, remote hearing, hearing things from a long distance, knowing others' minds, remembering our own past lives. And paranormal abilities is developing the ability to have some control over the elements, material elements. Do we achieve these abilities when we achieve shamatha? No. We don't automatically remember our past lives and all those sort of things. In fact, if we look in the meditation texts, then shamatha, the level of concentration above shamatha is called the first jhana. And then the meditation text it says that if we go on from shamatha to actually achieve the first jhana, and then we do certain specific practices, then on the basis of that first jhana, then we can start to develop these abilities here mentioned in the text. But then the text also says, and in particular, the Arya paths of all three vehicles are attained in dependence upon it. An Arya is anyone who's had a direct realization of emptiness. So therefore, to have a direct realization of emptiness, we need shamatha. Anything less than shamatha, our mind is not stable and clear enough to be able to fully penetrate reality, to have a direct realization of emptiness. And here when it talks about the three vehicles, it's a slightly different presentation than we looked earlier. The three vehicles being, earlier we looked at three vehicles of Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana. Here, the three vehicles are what's called the Shravaka vehicle, Pratyeka Buddha vehicle, and Bodhisattva vehicle. So here we're talking specifically within the sutra level of practice, not tantra. And Shravaka and Pratyeka Buddha, or hearers and solitary realizers, really come within Theravada context. and because they both have the goal of nirvana. They have a slightly different approach to practice, but the same goal. Bodhisattva vehicle is the Mahayana vehicle, the goal of enlightenment. So therefore, if we want to directly realize emptiness, we need shamatha. And so that's what we see actually in that shamatha diagram. The diagram in the middle at the top is a shamatha. So again, the person flying through the sky is a physical pliancy. The body feels light like cotton. Mental pliancy, the meditator riding on the elephant of the mind, turn our mind to whatever we want. So that's shamatha in the middle. To the right at the top, we now see the meditator riding the elephant of the mind, and in their right hand is a sword. That's a sword of wisdom. So that is now symbolizing the Vipassana practice, where we're using the sword of wisdom to cut through ignorance and mental afflictions and cut through suffering and achieve liberation from suffering. And here there's some text written with respect to that Vipassana practice there. And it says on that other chart, that's number 32 and 33. And it says, the root of samsara is cut by the union of shamatha and Vipassana observing emptiness. And so therefore, equipped with mindfulness and introspection, seek the correct view of emptiness. So we saw here in the Sutra Mahamudra, two approaches, but the Panchen Lama says the approach we're following is to seek the correct view after having meditated, meaning first meditate, achieve shamatha, and then we can seek the correct view of emptiness, Vipassana. But what this doesn't mean is that we first need to fully achieve shamatha before we begin Vipassana practice. Otherwise, we'll be waiting a long time. In fact, you'll probably find that without actually earlier introducing some Vipassana practice, you're going to find it extremely difficult to achieve shamatha because the mental afflictions will sort of get in the way a bit. But if we introduce a bit of Vipassana practice, that will start to cut those mental afflictions a little bit, which means that it'll make it easier to go further and deeper into shamatha practice. But what it does mean, this diagram, is that if we don't do any shamatha practice and our attention skills are very poor and we just go straight into Vipassana practice, then we're not really going to make any headway in Vipassana practice. So therefore, first start shamatha practice, improve mindfulness, develop our attention skills. And then once we start to get into that shamatha practice a little bit and we start to have a little bit more calm, clear, focused mind, then we can start to do some Vipassana practice, but all the while continuing to work on shamatha practice. But then eventually we'll need to unify those two. We need to have a union of shamatha and Vipassana, observing emptiness, to start to overcome mental afflictions and suffering. And then finally, at the end of the shamatha section of the text, the Panchen Lama concludes the shamatha section with saying the following. He says, in that way, the nature of the mind can indeed be directly and clearly seen. However, it cannot be grasped or indicated saying it is this. So we saw that earlier, that when we achieve shamatha, we will realize the conventional nature of the mind. We'll directly see that the mind is clear and knowing, has clarity and awareness. But it's not going to be a thing that we'll say, it's this or it's that. But then he goes on to say, rest loosely without grasping to whatever dawns. The meditators of present-day Tibet are mostly of a single mind in proclaiming that these are oral instructions that put Buddha in the palm of your hand. So what he's saying is that a lot of his contemporary practitioners of his time, 16th, 17th century Tibet, were saying that instructions such as rest loosely without grasping to whatever dawns, if we just follow that instruction, that's going to put Buddhahood in the palm of our hand, meaning that these instructions, simply by following that instruction of just rest loosely without grasping to whatever dawns, will set us directly on the path to enlightenment. But then Panchen Losang Chögyal Gyaltsen says, nevertheless, I, Chögyal Gyaltsen, say that this approach is a marvelous, skillful method for beginners to accomplish mental stillness and is a way to introduce the conventional nature of the mind. So what he's saying is that instructions such as rest loosely without grasping to whatever dawns are definitely instructions that will help us to achieve mental stillness, meaning, and a way to introduce the conventional nature of mind, meaning that these sort of instructions will definitely help us to achieve shamatha. Whether or not that they can go on and help to achieve enlightenment, that's debatable. And what we're going to see actually in the next part of the text, which we're going to do next weekend when we go into Vipassana, and we look at some of these oral instructions which come in Vipassana part of the Kagyu Mahamudra texts, they're very similar or almost identical to the instructions we've seen here in the Shamatha part of this text. And so this is what Panchen Losang Chögyal Gyaltsen is saying, that these sorts of instructions definitely a wonderful method for us to achieve shamatha. Whether these sorts of instructions can help us to go on to realize the ultimate nature of the mind and achieve enlightenment, well, that's not so certain. That's what he's saying. And so that then completes the shamatha part of Sutra Mahamudra. And so now we will go to the practice. And what I'd like to do is a practice that's often called open awareness. And so we've done two variations of this shamatha practice of observing the mind within this context of Mahamudra. The first one was observing thoughts. The second one was resting in stillness. Now, these practices can help us to achieve shamatha, but also we would want to be able to bring these practices into daily life, because also we want to be able to observe our thoughts in daily life without getting caught up. And we also want to be able to rest in that stillness in daily life as well, to have that as our default mode in daily life when our mind is not actively engaged in some activity. And so this open awareness is what we would do in daily life. And because in daily life, here in the shamatha practice of observing thoughts, we were only looking at mental events. Because if to narrow it down just to the observing mental events. In daily life, though, we want to be fully present with whatever's going on around us, including sense events. So open awareness here is not just observing mental events, it's whatever's arising in the mind, including sounds, sensations, and so forth. And so what we're going to do in this practice is we'll start, and again, we'll do this practice with the eyes open, because in daily life, we have our eyes open as well. We'll start with just the resting in stillness, resting in awareness practice. And that will help to establish a foundation, because that resting in the open, spacious stillness of awareness will provide us a good basis for being able to observe the movements of our mind. And so we'll start with that for a few minutes, establish that basis of resting in the open, spacious stillness of awareness. And then from that basis, then we'll start to observe the movements of the mind, whatever's coming up, including sensory things, sounds, sensations in the body, and so forth. And here we can adjust our practice depending on what's going on in our practice. If when we start to observe the movements of the mind, we start to get caught up in the movements of the mind, then shift back more into just resting in that stillness of awareness. So mainly then emphasize resting in the stillness of awareness, because that will then provide us an anchor for observing the movements if we're getting swept away. Or alternatively, if you find that you're simply drifting into dullness and drowsiness, then place more emphasis on the movements of the mind. Pay closer attention to the movements of the mind. And if you find in this practice you'll get completely lost, then go back into the body and observe the movements in the bodies. Just observe the tactile sensations in the body whilst resting in that stillness of awareness. Because it's the conceptual movements of the mind, our thoughts and emotions, that really pull us away. So if you're finding they're pulling you constantly away, then simply focus on the only movements being the sensations in the body. So again, while resting in stillness of awareness, just observe the movements within the body, the sensations within the body. We can use that as a way to move into this practice. So we'll do this open awareness practice here now. And then again, this practice will help us then to be able to transition the shamatha practice of observing thoughts and resting in awareness into daily life. Let's do that practice now. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin. The two most important things with the good posture is to keep the back nice and straight, and at the same time allow the entire body to become completely relaxed. And softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. Mouth and jaw, soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes, soft and relaxed. Allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. The breathing flowing naturally and effortlessly. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Resting your gaze in the space in front of you. Keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. And releasing all appearances. And allowing the mind to come to rest. Resting in the experience of awareness itself. Simply knowing that you're aware. Resting in that open, spacious stillness of awareness. Now, whilst resting in that stillness, start to become aware of the movements of the mind. All movements of the mind, thoughts, emotions, sound, sensations, and so on. Whatever is appearing to the mind, observe it. And if you're finding that you're constantly getting caught up in the movements of the mind, constantly getting caught up in thoughts, emotions, sounds, sensations, or so on, then place more emphasis on stillness. That is, mainly focus on resting in stillness. And then just a little bit in the corner of your mind, notice the movements of the mind. Or if you're finding that you're simply falling into dullness or drowsiness, then place more emphasis on the movements of the mind. That is, pay closer attention to whatever is appearing in the mind. And if you're completely lost in this practice, then shift back into the body. And that is, whilst resting in stillness of awareness, simply observe the movements within the body. That is, observe any tactile sensations within the body. And we can bring the meditation to a close. So we've got plenty of time for question and answer now. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and again, I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Do we have any questions so far, Shia?
Yes, one question from Tom. During shamatha practice, I have many short bouts of awareness, followed by
what? Sorry, so say again. Short what?
Short bouts. During shamatha practice, I have many short bouts of awareness.
Short bouts.
Bouts, yeah.
Yeah, bouts of awareness, sure.
Short bouts of awareness, followed by short bouts of forgetfulness. So overall, I'm awareness most of the session, but not continuously. What should I do to achieve a more continuous awareness?
Practice more. One of the things that we've seen here in terms of the prerequisites for shamatha, but also early in the terms of preliminaries, is that we need to have an effective basis for shamatha. Because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to make any significant progress. And certainly what we saw there was that in terms of the prerequisites, the importance of the view of genuine happiness, that if, and this, we're talking experiential now, not just intellectual. I mean, probably many of us already intellectually appreciate that the source of my happiness and suffering is not really out there, but we need to, through those preliminary practices and so forth, we need to make that a little bit experiential so that that can provide a counterforce for our instinctive attachment to pleasure, our instinctive aversion to unpleasant things. Because these are one of the sort of main driving reasons why we have difficulty in shamatha, in terms of even just laziness, in terms of doing the practice, because we're too busy. I've got to do all these things to get more stuff and so forth. But also then in terms of in the practice itself, to really help prevent and overcome laxity and excitation. So remember that the distraction in the meditation text in shamatha we saw was not actually listed as distraction, it's listed as excitation. And it's in the definition from Sankappa we saw it's a form of attachment. It's this sort of attachment, this craving for something out there, something nice, or the opposite, the aversion for something unpleasant out there. And so therefore, I think what can be very helpful to go deeper into shamatha is definitely that is very important. But also in terms of practice, we saw the outer conditions as the prerequisites, also the supportive environment very important as well. And unfortunately, many of us live in an environment whereby the external factors around us are really pulling us in the opposite direction that we want to try to pursue in terms of shamatha and other sort of practices. And so therefore, as best we can, I think it's going to be very helpful to provide, to set up those external conditions as best we can, in terms of particularly important that one we saw, the good friends, the like-minded companions, the idea of spiritual sangha. That I think that we really is very, very important, because if we try and do all of this on our own, then particularly as a beginner, we easily influenced by others. We've got a lot of bad habits and we get sort of swept up in those. And so we need some help in the practice. So we need to find these like-minded people, get connected with them and help each other, support each other. And so that we have some support for this practice. And that can also be very helpful in terms of being able to go deeper into this practice. And then also on top of that, I think what's going to be very helpful is that if we only sort of do a daily practice, and that's all we do, then again, we're going to find it difficult to make significant headway in the practice. So I think if we're really serious about going more, in these 9 stages, going past stage 1 and 2 and going beyond 3, 4 and onwards, then we really need to think about doing some sort of retreat as well, because that will really give us a boost in the practice. And when, in terms of doing retreats, I think it's always good to start with group retreats, because doing solitary retreats, even for a few days, if we're not used to that, that's going to be very difficult, because it's difficult because we don't have that support and inspiration and guidance and structure. So start with some group retreats, and then we can start doing some personal retreats, but start short, a day or 2 at a time. And so we can even factor that into our lifestyle. Particularly if we have a lifestyle where we're not sort of got a lot of commitments, maybe we don't have to work sort of 5 full days a week, or maybe we don't have a lot of family commitments. Then if we can factor in our weekly schedule a day or even half a day where we really devote to meditation practice. So, for example, if you don't have to work 5 days a week, or you're on flexi time or something, then ideally midweek, so midweek normally is Wednesday, but of course in Israel that's Tuesday. So maybe then, take Tuesday off work, or at least the whole morning of Tuesday off, if possible. And really then sort of switch off your mobile phones, and then really devote that time to meditation, practice and study and so forth, to really immerse yourself for a day or even half a day. And that will also really give us a boost in our practice. So that, I think, can also be helpful as well. And so these are some things that we can do to help to overcome this forgetfulness or distraction in meditation. But as I mentioned briefly earlier, we're always emphasizing quality over quantity. That if we really try and meditate too long in a single session and we can't sustain it, then we're really just going to fall into complete distraction or complete dullness for the latter part of the meditation. If we want to meditate longer, but we can't sustain it, then I would suggest breaking that up into short sessions with a little break. So let's say we want to meditate 45 minutes in the morning, but we can't sustain it, then break it into, say, 2 20-minute sessions with a little 2-minute break in the middle, always emphasizing quality over quantity. So having many short sessions as a beginner. But if we want to really go deeper into the practice, then we will need to start to increase the duration we meditate. Because if we're only ever meditating 15 minutes, there's only so much progress we can make. How to know when to increase the time to meditate? Then if our normal experience is that at the end of the meditation, our normal experience is that, I would have liked to have done a little bit more, then that's a sign to increase the duration of your meditation. Maybe from 15 to, say, 20 minutes, or 20 to 25 minutes, but always emphasizing quality over quantity. So these are some of the factors that can really help us to improve our stability and clarity of our attention in shamatha practice. But one last point, and that is that we really need to have an integrated approach to practice. That if we're only, say, doing shamatha practice, that's a little bit unbalanced, and you'll find that it'll be difficult to make significant progress if that's all you're doing. Even if you're spending quite some amount of time doing shamatha practice every day, that we need to have a balanced approach. We need to make sure, as we saw earlier in the text, that we continue to work on those preliminary practices that continue to give us a solid foundation for shamatha. But in addition to shamatha, we also need to spend some time and energy doing vipassana practice and compassion practice, because both of those practices will feed back into the shamatha practice. The compassion practice to really give us that positive, uplifted state of mind of loving kindness and compassion. That's really going to give us a driving force for shamatha. But also vipassana practice of emptiness will start to cut our mental afflictions. And so that will also feed back into shamatha. So really to not think, well, okay, I'm just going to do shamatha now. I'm going to spend 2 hours every day on shamatha, and that's all I'm going to do. I think that's a little bit lopsided in terms of practice. So we could initially emphasize shamatha, but we would need to really make sure that we are covering those other 3 areas of practice of the foundation, the preliminaries, and the compassion and vipassana practice. So that's a few points I think that can be helpful. So we've still got a bit of time for any more questions.
Yes, thank you. I think you answered the next question during that. I will read it anyway.
Sure.
Tivta asks, do you need to combine also practice on compassion with practicing shamatha, or is it happening spontaneously within knowing the nature of our consciousness?
Well, it'd be nice if it would happen spontaneously. I mean, of course, if we practice shamatha and our mind becomes more calm, more clear, more focused, you will find it much easier to develop loving kindness and compassion, but maybe it won't spontaneously arise. So we'll need to put some effort into it. But yes, we will need to certainly work on those compassion practices, but as I mentioned, also vipassana practices. And so if we really have it's almost like a balanced diet, that if we want to have a healthy body, we need all the main food groups. We need a balanced diet. How that balance works, like in the diet, may be slightly different from one person to another, but we need a balanced diet here of practice. And how we balance will shift a little bit depending on where we are in our practice. So sometimes you may need to emphasize a little bit more shamatha. At other times, you may need to emphasize a little bit more compassion. At other times, you may need to emphasize a little bit more vipassana or maybe even preliminaries. So we can adjust that balance depending on what's going on in our life. And the last point on that is, on top of all of this, if we have a qualified teacher who we can ask questions to and to give us clear guidance, that's also going to make it a lot better, because they can tailor all these practices to our own specific disposition and needs. Whereas if we just try to put all these things together ourselves, we may be wasting our time a little bit on some of those practices because we're not being as effective as we could. So having a qualified teacher is also going to be an enormous benefit. I think we've got time for at least one more question.
Yeah, we have a few more, but
sure. Sure.
So Dana asks, in the first meditation of this session, you said to sharpen the focus, and I told myself to focus about 2-3 times. It helped me to focus for a short while, but it felt like it was not a part of the practice and it didn't last long. Is that what you meant by focus?
So the sharpening the focus is to help us to overcome dullness. But as we saw, I think earlier, in terms of strategies for laxity, is that will sharpen the focus. But if we've sort of not got a lot of enthusiasm for the practice, if we're not that interested in the practice, then it's not going to last very long. We'll sharpen the focus, and then pretty quickly we'll fall back into dullness because we haven't we haven't got that enthusiasm for the practice. So we need to make sure that in these practices to have that enthusiasm for the practice by reflecting on the benefits of the practice and understanding this precious opportunity we've got to practice and to really uplift the mind. And that enthusiasm, I think, will go a long way to help avoid the mind sinking back into dullness once we've sharpened the focus. It's a little bit like watching an interesting program on TV. You know, maybe we initially need to sharpen our focus to pay attention, but then because we're so interested in the program, we stay very much clearly focused on the program. Whereas if it's a boring program on TV, even if we sharpen our focus, we may be able to pay attention to it for a short time, but then we're going to drift back into dullness and maybe even fall asleep. So I think that analogy can be very helpful to understand what we are to do here. Maybe one more question, then we'll need to stop.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll do last question from Orna. When observing the mind, can we imagine one of the 6 analogies we studied? For example, for quieting the mind, to think about a quiet ocean, and for movement, to think about the ocean breathing.
These 6 things we mentioned were ways or analogies that meditators use to remind themselves on how to sustain the practice. So as I mentioned earlier, I think as well in general, that if we have some analogies or some little bit of commentary that can help remind us what to do in the practice to stay focused in the practice, then yes, we can bring that in to help us to sustain the practice. But as we become more and more familiar with the practice, then we won't need to bring those things in, because the more that we bring them in later, then that will start to just become another distraction. So use them at the beginning if you find them helpful to sustain the practice and to go into the practice. But then slowly, as we get into the practice, we'll need to let them go, to go further and further into the practice. Okay, I think we've run out of time there. So let's leave the Q&A there. And just briefly, what we're going to do next weekend. So now in this text, we've covered the Shamatha part of Sutra Mahamudra. And so next weekend, we'll go into the Vipassana part of Mahamudra. The first part is a sort of a more general presentation of ways of introducing the ultimate nature of the mind. And then the bulk or the main part of that the Vipassana part is a presentation of emptiness. And so we'll go into quite some detail in terms of the presentation of emptiness and then how to do that practice in terms of Mahamudra, how to come to realize the ultimate nature of the mind. And then in terms of the last part of the text conclusion, part of that is also the post-meditation, how to sustain this emptiness practice outside of meditation, what we are to do there. And so we'll look at that as well in detail next weekend. So that's very briefly what we're going to cover next weekend in the 3 days of the second part of this retreat. And so let's leave it there, and let's again dedicate all of our efforts here today on the basis of the Shantideva dedication prayer. So again, while I read out the verses, you might like to reflect on the words. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Thank you. And so the next session will be next weekend. We'll start on the Friday, March 12th, 8:30, same time. And we'll start the first day with a review of some of the main points from this weekend's retreat before we move into the topic for next week, the Vipassana practice in Sutra Mahamudra. So until then, stay safe, stay well. Hope to see you in next Friday. Bye now.
Thank you very much, Glen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Glen. See you. Thanks you, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Shil, toda.
Next week.